Oh yeah, I think we'll be good there.
And Sarah said,
okay.
Tell you both thank you for letting Thursday's class slip to Sunday so that we could celebrate her birthday.
Oh, that's right. She texted me and she's like, "You better be quick tonight." And I'm like, "Oh shit, I don't think we have a class tonight, but I've messed up in the past, so that I got real nervous."
We're all good. I messed it up.
All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
All right. So we're gonna go through live flight plan. We're gonna plan an entire flight in this session. We're gonna talk about most things that we've learned about. We're not gonna touch on things like aerodynamics. We're not gonna touch on some of the regulations, but 80% of the stuff is going to culminate into this session. So this will be a good one. I've halfway drafted a flight plan that we're going to finish live here. Obviously need to wait until the day of the flight so that you have all your weather information and stuff like that. So we'll look at that in real time and make a flight plan. You guys can ask questions along the way. We can go through this thing. So with that, it's important, not necessarily part of the flight planning, but it is kind of tangentially important to understand trip purpose, mission purpose. Why are you flying to a particular place? If you're going to a place just for lunch or to hang out for a little bit, probably would have a different criteria on certain items than if you're going to spend a weekend or a week, or if you had to drop somebody off in a location specific area, because a lot of things come into play. I've put some of those things here on the screen. I think there's probably more than just these, but these are the ones I could think of. Probably the biggest one is fees. You're always going to be looking for probably the cheapest place to operate if you can. Sometimes you can't avoid that. If somebody that you're flying has to be somewhere specific, sometimes that means you have to land somewhere specific, and then fees will come into play. For example, if I want to fly to Houston, and if I can get away with flying into like West Houston Airport, I think parking's like $10 a night or some such thing. Fuel is $4.50 a gallon. But if I absolutely needed to fly to Houston Hobby, the fuel there is like $7 a gallon. I've heard that parking at Hobby is like $60 a night. So it's like supply and demand. Fees are a huge part of general aviation, and you guys will kind of learn which airports you can land at are fee friendly and which are not. Tower control versus pilot control, really during the initial stages of your training, just comes down to a comfort thing. I think it sounds like you guys will probably be doing a lot of tower controlled training, so that's good. It means you'll have to get some extra emphasis, spend some time operating at pilot controlled or non-towered airports so you can get comfortable there. A lot of times the pilot controlled airfields are cheaper to operate in and out of when it comes to fees. I would say a good portion of them, 3/4 of non-controlled airports probably have no fees at all. No parking, fuel's cheap. Maybe you can even get a crew car or a courtesy vehicle for the afternoon for free. I know that's a very popular thing here in Texas. Another important one is fuel availability, and you can see this on your sectional chart. The airports that have the little prongs sticking out of it, if you're going to be flying somewhere far and you know that you're going to have to top off the tanks, that's something to consider. Fuel pricing and availability. ForeFlight has a really cool function on it that will show you fuel pricing, and it's relatively real time. It's pretty up to date. And there's probably others. Hours of operations important. I know at my airport, the tower closes at 10 p.m. every night. So if you're going to be flying in there after 10, it turns into a class G airport, essentially. Class E airspace down to 700 feet. and then a Class G airport, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. So yeah, depending on what your mission purpose is, it may dictate different things as far as your flight goes. So with that, let's get down and dirty with the flight planning. Like I said, I have halfway drafted a flight plan and put some charts together here for a 220-mile trip from Sugarland to Alliance Airport to visit your ground instructor. Alliance Airport is in my backyard. It's probably 5 miles. In fact, my street, the Class Delta airspace intersects my street. So we're about 5 miles from the airport grounds at AFW. So just a couple high-level items that we talked about a couple classes ago to keep in mind. You want to be cognizant of the weather forecast 24 to 48 hours ahead of time. It really helps with not being surprised on the day of your trip. Now, if you're looking at the 10-day forecast and it's all sunshine, then you probably don't look at it as much. But if there's weather systems moving through, you tend to look at it more. You want to perform an I'm safe checklist. We talked about that last session. You want to kind of know what's going on with you 24 hours, 8 to 24 hours before your flight. That's part of being a pilot. You want to make sure that if there's weddings, events that you're going to, you're watching the alcohol rules, not just because they are regulatory in nature, but just, you want to be fit to fly. You want to make sure you're, in 10 out of 10 shape for your flight. And depending on the I'm safe checklist or the weather or even, the status of your aircraft, you want to have Plan B option lined up. It might be a commercial flight, it might be driving, because having a Plan B defined before your flight planning it makes it a lot easier to make that no-go decision if you already have an idea of what your Plan B might entail. For instance, if I was flying down to Houston VFR, and I knew that the weather might be crappy, I would maybe just make sure that I was okay driving and I had a good departure time driving if I absolutely had to be in Houston, just so that when I make that no-go decision, it's not so difficult. Already have a Plan B lined up. All right, so we're gonna plan this flight out in real time. I've got a couple charts prepared just to kind of help us along, but I'm going to be switching back and forth. I would say quite a bit. So if you kind of bear with me, I'll be switching screens. I'll be pulling up Excel here because I've got a flight plan laid out, and we'll kind of go through it. So if we remember from our session on flight planning, the first thing that we're going to do, for which everything else is kind of built off of, is to plot our course. I put a couple charts here together just to give us a refresher on plotting your course. If you guys remember, the sectional will give you two pieces of information as far as course goes. It'll give you lines of latitude and longitude relative to true north. And you can also get your isogonic magnetic lines that are relative to magnetic north. Of course, magnetic north and true north are offset by about 1,300 miles. So your compass will always show a different value than, say, your position relative to true north. Your aircraft's position relative to magnetic north is your magnetic course, and relative to true north is your true course. So just as a reminder, when we do our flight planning, we're going to be touching both true and magnetic courses to get our final compass heading, which you will use to fly your flight. Just as another piece of information to remember, the reason we care about true course or position relative to true north also is because some of our weather forecasting tools are in reference to true north. One example being our winds aloft forecast. Those are true north figures. So just kind of going along the lines of a refresher here, we've got our lines of latitude and our lines of longitude. We'll just kind of in parallel here pull up a sectional. So lines of latitude and longitude on the sectional are illustrated by the hashed gray-black lines meeting at 90-degree angles on the sectional. So that's our lines of latitude and lines of longitude, and of course they are a reference to true north. And then we have our isogonic magnetic variation lines, which are referenced to magnetic north. And on the chart, of course, those are the magenta dashed lines that are offset slightly from our lines of longitude. And just as we've talked about before, if you're in the middle of the country, it's relatively benign. I mean, we're looking at 3-degree difference here in the middle of Texas. But if you actually go out to, say, you know, the edge of the country, it gets a little bit more aggressive. So like out in California, we're looking at more like 12, 13 degrees offset. So as a refresher, magnetic course, or the you know, your aircraft's position relative to magnetic north is your true course adjusted for magnetic variation. The magnetic variation is that value that you get off that isogonic line on the sectional. So if I want to know what my magnetic course is going to be for a flight, I first have to find my true course and then adjust that true course for magnetic variation, and I will have my magnetic course. So that'll be the very first thing we do for this flight. So I've plotted the course, and here's kind of a subset of that. Let's just pull this up. I'm going to pull up ForeFlight. We're going to use ForeFlight a little bit during this session. Of course, you can do this on your iPad too, but I'll be honest with you, when I'm doing a flight, I'm doing a lot of flight planning on the computer. It's a lot easier. You can tab between different tools. You know, you can go to your Aviation Weather Center, etc. So let's do Sugarland to Alliance. There is our course. All right, and I've taken a little subset of that course and put it in the pitch. So let's go back there. Now, I would suggest, and hopefully your flight instructors are doing the same, as a learning mechanism, you're going to want to have a paper chart. You certainly can use ForeFlight. It does all the work for you, but it's really helpful to get a paper chart and a plotter and a pencil and a highlighter and do this manually so that you know what ForeFlight is doing in the background when it gives you your final value. So what we're going to do, if I'm sitting down here with a paper chart, I'm going to take reference to one of the lines of latitude with my plotter, or you can also use a protractor, but I would suggest using an actual aviation plotter. And you get your angle here from your reference point, from your line, latitude line. And you use your plotter, and you figure out that course line, that true course line, is 338 degrees. Remember, if we're taking an angle off of the latitude line or the longitude line, it's going to be relative to true north. So this 338 value is our true direction. Okay. But that's not going to help us when we fly the airplane because the compass is relative to magnetic north. So we know our true north, or our true direction is 338, but we really need our magnetic. We're essentially trying to, we're going to do this equation right here. Magnetic course equals true plus minus variation. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my sectional because I need my variation number. Let's find somewhere, I'm going to use somewhere on the midpoint of our course. I'm only going to take whole values. Looks like I've decided to use 3, but let's show that here. Let's verify that. Okay, so you can see here in the middle of the screen, I've got a 3 minute 30 second, or 3.5 degrees east. I'm just going to round that to 3. And remember, east is least, so we're going to subtract 3 from our true course. 338 minus 3, so I end up with a 335 degrees magnetic course number. Does all that make sense up to now?
Yes, but what did you just do whole numbers? Because more often than not, it's really hard to get a half number when you're setting your heading indicator and looking at your compass.
Yeah, your resolution when you're flying the airplane is just not good enough to consider half numbers.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Now, here's where the fun starts. So we can certainly fly our airplane using our magnetic compass, using the 335 magnetic course number that we just came up with right here. But we will have wind to deal with, and wind is going to push us off our course. And I put a little graphic here to just kind of remind us what the wind does. So if our magnetic course, say, is north, and in this example it's straight up, and we're going to be flying our airplane and we want to maintain that course, well, if we don't have any wind, then of course we can fly our airplane straight north. We don't have to adjust for any wind correction. But as soon as we introduce wind, which I have over here to the left, wind coming out of, call it the west, we're going to have to point our aircraft in a different heading in order to stay on that course. And the aircraft's actually going to weather vane through the air. It's going to fly like this. If we were to ignore a course correction for the wind and just fly straight, our airplane would eventually end up off course. It would end up flying like this. Okay, so wind correction angle will help us maintain our desired course direction. So yes, we could wait, or we could fly with a 335 heading on our magnetic compass, but depending on what our winds are doing, we'll probably end up off course. So this is the first point in our flight planning that we actually need to go look at some weather tools. And I'm gonna do 2 real quick here. I don't want to bog us down with too much information, but I'll do 2 different types here just to show you where you can get this information. I'm going to use ForeFlight as a first source, and I'm going to pick 2 different points. If you have a relatively short flight, you might be able to get away with 1 point, but this is a long flight. This is a 200-mile flight. I definitely want to understand what my winds are doing in a couple different areas. So let's pick, why don't we just pick this airport here. Looks like that's Houston Executive. And all right. So I'm going to go into the details here. Again, you can also do this on your iPad. But under the details for Houston Executive, there's going to be a winds tab. This will be, my first opportunity during the flight planning to kind of pick an altitude as well, because I want an altitude where the winds are favorable, meaning they are at my back. right? I want as little headwind as possible so that I can get to Fort Worth as quickly as possible. If I can get a tailwind, I'll take it. So looks like I've got tailwind city here. 3,000 feet, 6,000 feet, I've got a tailwind. 9,000 feet, I've got a tailwind. This is great. What an excellent day to fly to Fort Worth from Houston. Now, for the purposes of this session, I'm going to pick 6,000 feet. It's got the highest speed. It's got the most favorable direction and highest speed, although 2 knots probably won't make a huge difference. Plus, you're dealing with forecasting accuracy. So I'm going to go ahead and pick 175 at 8 knots. That's going to be my forecast speed close to Houston, my forecast wind close to Houston. So let's just get that jotted down. That's near my departure airport. Okay, let's get a second. Like I said, I want to get a second wind forecast, and let's get closer to Dallas here. We'll just get one of the Fort Worth. All right. Well, we'll do Fort Worth Meacham. If you remember from our session on wind forecasting, there's only a finite number of wind forecasting stations. All of the stations surrounding Dallas-Fort Worth shared one wind forecast. So it doesn't matter which airport I click on here. They're all going to have the same wind forecast. Okay, so the winds at 6,000 feet, the winds kind of shift westerly. 270 at 2 knots. I could, if I wanted to, descend down to 3,000 feet and continue taking advantage of my tailwind. But for the ease of flight planning, I'm going to stay at 6,000 feet, and we'll use this as an opportunity to deal with a little bit of crosswind. So yeah, go ahead.
Quick question, Adam. Just to circle back, and then this may be adding complexity to the conversation, but for the sake of flight planning, don't we have to be at even number plus 500 since we're headed that direction on the left side of the compass?
We do.
We have to be like 4,500 or 6,500. We couldn't be at 3 or 6. That's even numbers are for IFR, right?
Right. So you're going to use, I mean, if I was going to be flying, say, at 6,500, I would use the 6,000 foot forecast. Yeah. You could technically interpolate, and in the case of this example, it might be okay to interpolate, but that's pretty complex because you're only talking 500 feet away from this forecast here. So what I would do, even if I'm going to be doing 6,500, I would use the 6,000 foot forecast. If I was doing 4,500, I would probably interpolate between the 2 wind forecasts, between the 3 and the 6,000, being that 4,500 is in between the 2. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So to interpolate, what I'm saying there is, I would pick the average direction between 178 and 270, right? Which is probably somewhere in the 200 or 220 range. And then I would take 3 knots, being in between 2 and 4 knots. But for simplicity, we'll probably end up choosing a cruising altitude around 6,500 and use our 270 at 2 knots forecast.
Okay. Should we be writing these? I'm kind of following along on paper here. Should we be writing these down at this point, or we just?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm gonna put them here on the screen to help me remember them.
Okay.
So, and then, so you can, once you guys start your flight training, and certainly before you get into cross-country flight planning, I would recommend investing in one of these old school computers here, the E6B flight computer, because on the back of this thing has a here, let me get a different picture. I should have gotten them. On the back has a wind correction plotter. So essentially, on the back of this thing, you follow a series of steps, and it's got this trigonometric scale on it, and it will give you your wind correction angle. Essentially, it'll give you the angle that you need to maintain relative to the wind so that you maintain a certain course. And it does that using these values that we just jotted down, using the wind values. Okay. Now, I've got E6B in front of me, but it doesn't really do me any good to do this because I can't do the wind calculation live. However, because this is live flight planning, yeah, go ahead.
I've got one in front of me, so it would still be a worthwhile exercise if we went through it.
You want to? Okay, you want to do it? Okay.
Let me drive Chris crazy. I mean, I want to be respectful of her time too.
Very good. Let me actually go grab a pencil real quick. Be right back. All right.
Are you cool if we go through that, Chris?
Yeah, of course. No, it's helpful to see it.
By the way, I have an extra one I can give you if you want, depending upon where you end up landing with flight schools and whatnot.
Oh, why do you have an extra one?
Because I bought one, and then the Anson Air makes you do the Cessna flight school, and you buy a bag with all the training materials, and one of the things in there is a E6B computer. So I had bought one on Amazon, then I got a second one when I had to buy that. So.
Oh, got it. Well, I'll probably have the same bag.
Okay, cool. Well, just let me know.
I know. Yes, thank you.
The E6B is great. It's a marvel. You try to figure out how the damn thing works. It's great, but
it's pretty awesome.
Whoever invented it, I hope they're just filthy rich. So, okay, so let's go through this real time. Let's go back to our pitch. Okay, so we're gonna, for the purposes of this long flight, it's a long flight, so I want to have at least two different wind correction angles, and then as you're doing your flight, you'll realize whether or not how accurate they were. You can kind of plot your course in real time. So let's do the first one. So flip over to the back of your E6B to the wind plotter.
Do we need true airspeed for this?
Yeah, we do. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you it's 135. For this flight planning, we're going to use my airplane, the Piper Arrow.
Okay, cool.
All right. So what I like to do is I like to put the center of the wheel of the spinner on the 100 number. So slide your grommet, the metal grommet, under the 100 point.
Yep, I'm there.
And then set the wind direction up at the top under the index. So we're going to start with 175. So slide your circle, your whiz wheel, to the 175. So the 175 is showing under the true index.
Okay.
Okay. Next step is you're going to mark you're going to make a mark for the wind velocity up from that 100 point. So here's our wind velocity. It's 8 knots. So take your pencil and put a dot on the 8 line up from 100. Okay.
As a side tip, I went out and bought ultra fine dry erase markers for this, and they've been working really well.
Oh man, that's a good idea. Here I am with eraser marks all over my windscreen. So mark your 8 knots up from center point, and then we're going to put our true course. We're going to spin our wheel again so that our true course is now under the index. So what you kind of see going on here is we're setting our wind reference velocity under our wind direction, and then the trigonometry is going to be done for us here. We're essentially going to spin this wheel around to our true course number, which is 338. So spin it around to 338.
Why don't you use your magnetic here? Is it because the wind is the true as well?
Well, you could. Well, so you could use your magnetic, but we're gonna add that after.
Okay.
What I
Okay.
typically do is I do all my wind planning under true, and
Cool.
then there's a scalar for your magnetic variation at the end. You could do it. Put it this way: you could do it either way because your magnetic variation is a addition subtraction thing. It's not like a factor.
Gotcha.
Yep. I would be willing to bet that your flight instructor is probably going to teach you to do true course plus wind correction angle, even though I've put magnetic course plus wind correction angle on here. You still get to the same number either way.
Okay.
All right. So the next step is going to be you take your slider and you're going to slide the little mark up to the 135 number, which I'm going to say is our Piper Arrow's true airspeed, 135. And then the first piece of information, and then you're done. You don't have to move, slide, spin. You're done. You can keep your whiz wheel in its configuration here. And then there's two pieces of information that you can read from your dial. Number one is the correction angle, the wind correction angle. So for me, if I did this accurately, I've got about a 1 degree, call it maybe half a degree to a 1 degree correction to the left. Is that what you're seeing?
How would I know?
Because your dry erase mark is to the left of center course of the center line.
Yep.
And it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 degree. So if you look at the scale, it's each line is 2 degrees until you get up to the 150 mark, or it should be.
So okay. So just kind of explain what I'm seeing right now. I have a black dot to the lower left of my metal grommet.
Yes.
Right, and you're saying that dot off the center line. See, mine's right on the first line to the left of the center line, but yours is more in the middle.
Mine's more in the middle, but it depends what your scale is on your flight computer.
And
so
you see the scale.
So if you go up to kind of the center, do you see, I've got it up, I'm sharing my screen.
Yep.
Do you see the 5, 10, 15, 20 out to the left?
Yes.
So that's your,
okay, yeah, mine's 1 degree as well.
yeah, so 1 degree. So that's the first piece of information. If it's to the left, then you're going to correct your heading to the left, and in this case, it's 1 degree. And then the second piece of information that you're given here is your ground speed. And your ground speed is actually indicated under the metal grommet. So I've got a number somewhere around 143.
Yep, I'm right around 142.
Okay.
So
yeah. Okay, good. So ground speed of 142. I'll keep writing stuff down here.
So when it's 1 degree to the left, is it 1 degree to the west then?
In this particular flight, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's not always that case. I'm just looking at the correction angle based upon where the 338 heading is, suggests that it would be 1 degree to the west versus to the east.
Say that one more time.
I keep going. I may answer my own question by just listening.
Okay. 1 degree and then 142 knots, right? Okay. All right. So in summary here, man, my computer's going nuts. So in summary, we use the whiz wheel, the wind side of the whiz wheel here to get your wind correction angle and your ground speed, 2 different pieces of information. Let's do let's do our 270 at 2 knots now. So erase your mark and put your grommet back to 100.
Okay.
Okay. All right, and now let's follow the steps again. So we're going to set wind direction. Step one is to put wind direction under your index. So in this case, it's 270 or west. And step two is to mark the wind velocity up from the grommet. So this one is slight, 2 knots. This one's going to be pretty negligible, but we'll go through it here.
It's hard to mark.
It's very hard to mark.
Right on the grommet itself.
Yeah, this one is going to be pretty negligible, but it's okay. So so we set wind direction and we set wind velocity up from center. Now we're going to put our true course under the index. So it's going to be that 338 number. And then we're going to slide the wind velocity mark up to 135.
Oh, that's why I had it wrong last time. I did 134.
Mm.
Okay.
So as you can see, it's pretty negligible. In fact, from a realistic standpoint, I wouldn't even worry about it, because when you're on your flight and you're flying to Fort Worth, I mean, the resolution of the forecast probably has more to, will probably have more of an impact than you accurately calculating your wind correction angle. But it looks like the wind correction angle is to the right by maybe half a degree.
Okay, I did something wrong then.
Okay, what are you looking at?
I had it to the left. Okay, let me try this again. So we do 270.
Slide it back to 100. Yep.
And then I'm going to put right above on the 270 line, I'm going to.
Oh, you know what? No. I had it wrong. I was doing 238, not 338.
Oh,
You're good.
Okay.
You're good. Yep. Okay. So I'm getting about 1 degree to the left or so.
Yep, I got the same.
Okay. All right, and I've got, the speed. It's like it's like 132 maybe. 134.
Yeah, that sounds right. Okay.
Okay. All right. So that is how you determine. That's how you determine wind correction angle using your E6B. Do you want to go through another example?
I'm good. Chris,
Okay.
you good?
I'm good. I have a different question though. How
Yep.
many points do you pick? Like, is it just a rule of thumb of like X amount of nautical miles you need to pick 2 versus 3 versus 4?
Well, you're going to find that there are very few, relatively very few reporting stations compared to your flight. So, for instance, the Dallas reporting station is probably this big. It's probably everything in the screen, maybe even bigger. And then there's another reporting station about halfway through the route in College Station. That's a reporting station. And then there's another reporting station in Houston. So you could, for this particular trip, you could add a third reporting station if you wanted to include College Station. But you're limited to the number of wind forecasting stations there are. You could pick, 15 different locations along this route, and some of them would give you all the same information.
Okay.
So, quick question again. I missed the rule of thumb and then the airport indication that has wind collection.
She was asking how many, is there a rule of thumb for how many points?
Yeah, I missed your answer on it.
There's not. You just have to be cognizant that you don't want to really look at too many because there's not that many reporting stations.
And how did you tell if there's a reporting station by looking at the sectional?
Let's see. You can't by looking at the sectional.
Okay.
But sometimes ForeFlight will give you ForeFlight. The computer version does not, but let's see if the iPad version does. The iPad version doesn't either. So let's see, where have I seen? I'll have to think about the source of weather information. But if you look, let me go to Aviation Weather Center, and you can actually see the weather, the wind stations. So if you look down here,
Yeah, okay.
so you can see along our route of flight, there's only 3 stations. There's Houston, College Station, and Dallas. So they split all the airports up. Like ForeFlight, for instance, they take all the airports in the general vicinity of these reporting stations, and they all report the same station wind forecast.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, so you're limited by the number of reporting stations you have.
Thanks.
Yeah. But it would be interesting to see what College Station's given us, just because the wind forecast between Fort Worth and Houston seems to be pretty drastic. So 216 at 4. So it's not, I mean, essentially we're going from a complete tailwind in Houston to kind of a quartering left tailwind, College Station, to like direct crosswind in Fort Worth. You guys see that?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. So if we just use, so here's the Houston winds at 6,000. It's 208 at 7. Wow, the forecast changed while we were doing this. 208 at 7. And then it shifts, you get up to the College Station reporting area, shifts to 216. So it's a little bit more quartering to the left. Then you get up to Fort Worth here, and it's probably changed. 296 at 3. So we're going from a tailwind to a quartering tailwind. You know, we're going from 200 to 216 to 296. So it's almost coming around to a complete headwind.
Mm-hmm.
So, so we'll use these, even though we've got updated values. We'll keep these values for now. So okay, so we've got our wind correction angle. So I'm going to finish filling this out. So 335 magnetic, and if we're near Houston, we're going to subtract 1 degree, and we're going to end up with 334. And according to our assessment for Fort Worth, if we're using the wind values here, we're also going to subtract 1 degree. So our magnetic heading is going to be 334 the entire trip. Does all that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Final step to get what we're actually going to look at when we look at our compass. We're going to take our magnetic heading and account for our compass deviation. You guys remember what deviation is on the compass?
Yes. It's how the compass is affected by the electrical fields within the cockpit from the instruments and the metals and whatnot.
Right. And it looks something like this. So when you have your compass card in the airplane, your compass card is usually located right on your compass, and it gives you your deviation values. So what this compass card is saying, if I'm going to fly a heading of north, so for north, you're going to steer -1 degree. So your deviation is -1. In our example, we're flying somewhere near the 330 number, okay? Not exactly 330, but close enough. And so for 330, we're going to steer +1. Our deviation is going to be +1. Is that clear for you guys?
Yeah, so it's almost the deviation counteracts the wind correction.
That's exactly right. Yep. So we're going to take our 334. We're going to add our 1. And we're going to end up back up at 335. So our compass heading, the number that we look at on our compass while we're making this flight is going to be 335. Which, when you get back to it, when you go all the way back to the beginning, is really, really, really close to our true course of 338. So did all that math for 3 degrees.
That can make a big difference over 200 miles.
Yeah, you got it, man. That's right. You know what? Your E6B, if you flip it over, I'm pretty sure that it can calculate that. It can give you how many miles off course you'd be.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So, real quick summary here. We start off with our true course, which is measured off of our lines of latitude, okay? So we get that angle, that 338 degrees relative to true north. We go through our series of calculations. First, magnetic course, which takes true course and accounts for magnetic variation, which is those magenta lines. Once we incorporate wind correction, we now have our heading, magnetic heading. Once we incorporate deviation, we'll have our compass heading. So this will be our final, what we look at on our compass. And if we have a heading indicator in the airplane, what we look at on our heading indicator. All right. All good on that stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Alan brought up a point about our altitude. So the next, now that we've studied our winds, we know what our wind correction angle is going to be. We already know what altitude we're thinking about flying. We pick an altitude usually based off of favorable winds. We've picked the 6,000 region. And to Alan's point, we have to pick a legal VFR cruising altitude. So I think we're going to go with 6,500. Remember, for magnetic headings, from north to 179, it has to be odd. From 180 to 359, it has to be even. And if you're a VFR, you've got to add 500. So we'll go with 6,500 for this particular flight. And a good reminder, this is magnetic. These numbers here, the 0, the 179, the 180, the 359, they're magnetic. Those are magnetic values. Those are with reference to magnetic north.
And this is respect to your course, not your heading.
Right. When you plot your course, this is what you're going to be referencing.
So if you're crabbing and your nose of your plane is pointing differently, that doesn't matter. It's the ultimate heading of the course of your plane versus the heading. Okay.
Correct. And the reason for that is, well, one of the reasons is air traffic control. They don't necessarily know or care what heading your aircraft is pointed. They only care what direction it's traveling. So the reason that we have VFR cruising altitude regulations is for aircraft separation. You want the guys traveling to the east to be on an odd altitude, and the guys traveling to the west to be on an even altitude. So air traffic control doesn't really care what direction your nose is pointed. They only care what course track your aircraft is taking through the sky. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So now we have plotted our course. That's step one. It's usually the biggest, longest step. We've plotted our course from A to B. We know what our compass heading is going to be because we've incorporated wind, we've incorporated magnetic variation, and we've incorporated deviation. The three steps to get your final compass heading. Next step, now that we know our heading and we know our altitude, our cruising altitude, is we want to check airspaces. What airspaces are we going to be flying through on our cross country? We're going to want to look for potential obstructions along our route of flight. And in doing so, we're going to kind of naturally start picking some visual waypoints, some VFR waypoints that we can identify along our route of flight, and check our time, distance, speed measurements as we go. So airspace, obstructions, waypoints is the next step. So for this, I usually like to go over to the sectional and just start plotting my way along. I think I mentioned last time, depending on experience and comfort level, you will pick waypoints that are, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, 15, maybe 20 miles apart. For this particular flight, I went ahead and pre-selected some waypoints. And I went ahead and I selected about 20-mile intervals for my waypoints. Your flight instructor may have you start off doing 10 or 15-mile intervals. But this is a long flight, so if you're selecting 10-mile intervals, you'll have 20-some waypoints. You'll be, looking at waypoints all the time. So I went ahead and just pre-selected 20. But let's before we get to waypoints real quick, let's check airspace. Of course, the Houston airspace is pretty busy. Right off the bat, what do we see? We've got a TFR. We've got a TFR. Man, they even have the teams that are playing. Mariners at Astros.
That's cool.
So that's active. So that is active right now. And then we've got other TFRs that are inactive, but they're published. So it looks like we've got TFRs published for next weekend's college football games. So we need to be mindful of that. Alan, I don't know what's typical at Sugar Land. Do you guys, when you do departures, you usually avoid the hobby airspace? Do you depart to the west?
We actually report to the southwest. Our practice area is on heading 240 out of the airport, so southwest area. We get out of that area as quickly as possible. If you go to Sugar Land Airport, no, sorry, go back. Leave it. Sorry, put your mouse over where you just were. All right, now if you look southwest, you'll see what looks like a crow's foot of roads.
Yeah.
That's where the practice area starts. So if you move your mouse up to the left, a little bit more north, see how right there's a branch of 3 roads coming out?
Mm-hmm.
They call that the chicken foot, and that's the entrance to the Sugar Land practice area. So my practice area is basically due west, north and south inside those top and southmost roads. Okay,
very, very good. So it's safe to say if you're going on a cross country to Dallas, Fort Worth, you're probably going to do a similar departure, head for that crow's foot, and then proceed north.
Yeah, just get out of Class Bravo.
Mm-hmm.
With Bravo clearance.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, awesome. Well, kind of maybe an advanced topic for this session, but if we have time at the end, we can talk about it. Another thing you can do, if you're going to be selecting flight following, if you're gonna get flight following from ground control while you're on the ground or immediately after departure, sometimes it helps to look at the departure procedures for the airport, the instrument departure procedures, something that doesn't really apply for VFR aircraft because I would say maybe 50% of the time or 60% of the time, air traffic control actually have you fly that procedure, even as a VFR pilot, because to them, you're just another aircraft in the system who they're giving radar control to, right? And maybe if we have some time at the end of the session, let me make a note. We'll go back and look at the instrument procedures for Sugar Land and see if they have a departure procedure. Kind of more of an advanced topic, not something you're going to have to know for your VFR cross country. All right, so again, we're looking at airspace and obstructions. So we're going to be departing Sugar Land kind of to the west here, Crow's Foot, and then immediately as we turn north, we kind of have some airspace we got to worry about. We've got the Houston Executive Class Delta, okay. which I'm kind of circling with the mouse right here. And then we've got our class Bravo. So two things. One, if we're going to get VFR flight following, there's an extremely good chance that air traffic control is going to clear us into the class Bravo. But you cannot assume that's going to happen. So I always like to go in with worst case flight planning. I'm going to assume that we're going to avoid these airspaces altogether. So looking at the sectional, we can see that Houston Executive has a ceiling of 2,500 feet MSL, denoted by the 2.5 in that hatched box. So to avoid that airspace, I'm going to have to climb above 2,500 feet. But to stay out of the Bravo airspace, I'm going to have to stay below 3,000. Here's the upside down wedding cake altitudes for the class Bravo. Says that the Bravo goes from 3,000 up to 10,000 feet. Or alternatively, I can avoid these airspaces altogether, fly far enough out to the west. So perhaps I fly all the way over here closer to Eagle Lake Airport and then proceed north. It's all really up to the pilot, right? You save a little gas if you turn directly north and skirt the airspaces, or request class Bravo clearance, or you can completely avoid it by flying clear west out here, Eagle Lake VOR, and turn north.
How do you determine which frequency?
What's that?
How do you figure out which frequency to call to request class Bravo clearance? Is it Houston departure or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple ways you can get that. You can go to your supplement handbook. So let's go to the chart supplement. My favorite method is looking at the instrument procedures, but you don't, as a VFR pilot, you don't always have your instrument procedures on hand. But let's pull up Sugarland. By the way, you can see this in ForeFlight too. This comes in ForeFlight package. But
I've gone where you're going. I just didn't know which one.
So here's your frequency. So if you want VFR flight following, you'll request it from Houston Approach Departure Control.
How do you know that? Is it always approach departure control?
Mm-hmm. So flight following is an approach and center air traffic control service.
Okay.
It's not your tower, your ground control and your tower will not provide flight following, because that's a terminal service. It's what's called a terminal service. They're only in control of aircraft coming and going from the airport.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm. Now,
the one that's right next to it, that's when the tower is closed? Is that redirecting you somewhere else?
right here. So
yeah.
So what this says is, if you need to get a clearance, say you filed an instrument flight plan with Flight Service Station, FSS. If the tower is open, you're going to contact ground control to get your clearance, or clearance delivery, but they're the same frequency, 1214. Okay. What this is telling you is that when the tower is closed, in other words, the tower controllers and the ground controllers who sit in the same room at the airport, when that function's closed for the night, you need to dial in this frequency to get your clearance, 119.25. And I bet, without looking, I would bet that that's the same frequency that Houston Hobby uses. They're probably utilizing someone else's clearance delivery people. Now, clearance delivery is an instrument topic, so you're not expected to know really clearance delivery. Well, I say that, but their VFR pilots can use it when they go into like busy Class Bravo airports. But clearance delivery is not typically something that you're going to be using unless you're an instrument pilot.
Okay.
Yeah, essentially clearance, going back to Alan's question and point about VFR flight following. VFR flight following is a radar service for VFR aircraft. You essentially get the same types of services that an instrument flight plan, an IFR pilot would get on VFR flight following. So because of that, you essentially get a clearance when you request VFR flight following, and the approach controller comes back and states November 1, 2, 3, 4 squawk, and then gives you a squawk code. You're essentially getting a clearance similar to what an instrument instrument flight plan aircraft would get. Instrument pilots, if you're on an instrument flight plan, they operate by a different set of rules. They can't take off and then request the radar services like a VFR pilot can. They actually have to contact somebody while they're on the ground. So hence clearance delivery or ground control. And they have to actually activate their flight before they even take off. So two different sets of rules. VFR pilots can actually depart the aircraft or depart the airport and then request their VFR flight following. The standard procedure for an instrument pilot on an instrument flight plan is to call clearance delivery while they're on the ground and activate their flight, activate their clearance. So that's what the clearance delivery frequency is. Does that answer question? Does that answer everything?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's a lot of information. I don't want to confuse, but it's clearance delivery is more so for instrument pilots. You guys will learn that when you go get your instrument ratings. Okay. So if we're going to get VFR flight following, Alan, I would guess too that being that Sugar Land is a controlled airport, I would venture a guess that the ground controller can initiate VFR flight following for you while you're on the ground.
Yeah, I'll let you know once I get into that part of the flight training.
Yep, let me know, because what they do, even though they're not responsible for flight following because it's a terminal service, what they do is they pick up the phone and they call the Houston approach controller and they say, hey, I've got November 1, 2, 3, 4 here on the ground requesting VFR flight following. And then the approach controller on the phone will give the ground controller your squawk code. And then the ground controller will relay the squawk code to you on the ground.
Got it.
Yeah. And depending on which terminal area you're talking about, I know DFW, they love this. Like DFW, they prefer to give you VFR flight following clearance on the ground before you even take off. Just less work for them. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, okay, so we're departing Sugar Land, and if we stay on our course line, getting back to airspace, we're going to be climbing up to our 6,500 foot cruising altitude, but we have to be mindful of Class Delta over here for Houston Executive and Class Bravo over here. Once we exit the Class Bravo area, we're relatively Class Echo for the rest of the trip. And I'm going to scan here as we go north, but I don't see any restricted airspace. I don't see any military operations areas. I don't see any prohibited airspace. And I don't see any TFRs until you get into DFW, and then there's a couple of TFRs, active and one inactive one. I've got AT&T Stadium is going to be active on the 23rd, so we're not worried about that today. Okay, then I've got the President Bush TFR over here in Dallas, but we're not flying over there. So airspace looks pretty clean. Once we get into the DFW terminal area, we will have to be cognizant of our altitude. Okay, I've got a 4,000 foot ceiling here. Okay. I've got a 3,000 foot ceiling ring here. In addition, I've got Class Delta airspace, the blue dotted line. So I've got Arlington to deal with. I've got Class Bravo to deal with. And if you do the math, if you visualize it, if I truly am gonna take this course line, then I have to be at an altitude between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Otherwise, I'm in somebody's airspace. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oops. And then all the way to Alliance Airport. And it looks like 3,000 feet is the only ceiling I really have to worry about. So from a flight planning purpose, I'm probably going to, if I absolutely don't want to talk to anybody, if I don't want to get any clearances, then I'm probably going to fly around 2,500 feet because that keeps me below the Bravo of 4,000 feet and 3,000 feet. And it keeps me above Arlington. So 2,500 appears to be the ticket. If I, like I said, if I don't want to talk to anybody, get a clearance and you know, have air traffic control clear me through airspace. Perfectly legal, not advised, but perfectly legal.
So when you see the negative in front of the 20, that means up to, not including 2,000 feet?
Correct. So you could technically fly at 2,000 feet and be clear of their airspace.
Okay.
So how does that affect your wind correction angle? Because didn't you calculate it at 6,000?
Yeah, so no, you're absolutely right. If we go to a weather forecast, it's probably going to affect our wind correction angle. Let's see by how much. So it looks like if we go down to 2,500, we're going to have more of a tailwind. See this 172 at 4? And so if I were to go back to my whiz wheel, I would probably learn that would probably take out my wind correction angle of 1 degree. But yeah, no, good point. If we're gonna adjust altitude, you could go back to your winds and see what that does to your flight planning. For the values that we're seeing here, it's not real big. It's not too significant. Not a huge difference. Now, if you had, if this was 30 knots and this was 35 knots, the higher the wind velocity, of course, the more of an effect that's going to have on your wind correction angle. So if we're flying up here at like 27,000 feet, our wind planning has to be a little bit more precise because 35 knots, depending on what angle that is on your aircraft, if it's a direct crosswind, it's going to be, I mean, you could be you might have to weather vane your aircraft into the wind by 10 or 15 degrees. But for these purposes, I probably wouldn't hassle with it. While I'm talking here, I'm doing a wind calculation on the back of the wind scale, and it's still about ½ a degree. So it doesn't really change our wind planning that much. All right, so airspace is good. I did do a quick scan for some obstructions along the route, which is good to do. You'll notice there are some obstructions, particularly when you get to DFW. Over here, we've got these radio towers. They call them the Cedar Hill radio towers. In fact, actually good to point these out because if you look at the numbers, they are right at the altitude we may be flying. If we do choose to descend down to 2,500 feet, it might be. So that's an important one to watch out for. Along the route of flight, we don't have anything too significant. It looks like we've got a lighted tower at about 1,300 feet MSL. I don't see many other obstructions in the terminal area, and I didn't see too many crazy obstructions along the route of flight.
Are those extensive helicopter activity areas, would that be considered obstructions or just something that you have to look out for?
Probably something you watch during your flight. You're going to run into glider area. So you're going to run into glider training areas. And then where did you see the helicopter note?
Zoom in toward the bottom of the Dallas area. It was by the Cedar Towers. There's actually
okay.
Rectangle. There you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So yeah. No, you would absolutely watch out for that. And I'll be completely honest with you. One of the reasons to actually utilize air traffic control services is for stuff like that. That is that's the Bell helicopter, one of the Bell helicopter manufacturing facilities. And so they do helicopter testing all the time down there. But they utilize air traffic control services. So why not be a part of the communication string, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'll see when you get into your training, you'll see all different types of pilots, some who like to be quiet on the radios and not talk to anybody, and then those who like to be a part of the action. When you're flying into busy terminal areas, it's extremely important to be part of the action for reasons like this. Oh, and by the way, they'll probably clear you through the class Bravo, and you won't have to descend down to 2,500 feet. You probably stay up at your altitude. So what I did was I've got a pre-populated list of waypoints here that I just did the other day. They're, between 15 and 20, 25 miles apart, and they're just visual waypoints. I did not include any real VORs. This is no VOR navigation going on. This is simply piloting by use of visual waypoints through a straight line course. Some pilots will plan their flight to these waypoints, So for instance, I'm going Sugarland to Houston Executive to the town of Waller. So I'm going to fly along my route here, and then I'm going to look out the window to the left and take note that Houston Executive is right over here to my left. And then I'm going to fly further north to my next waypoint, and I'm going to look out to my left and notice that the town of Waller is to my left. Some pilots and some instructors too, so be prepared for whatever your instructor wants you to do, will actually plan their flight to land right on the waypoint. Okay, so Houston Executive, and then we're going to go to Waller. Okay, and then we're going to go to the next waypoint. And so I personally I do not like this kind of flight planning because it's a whole bunch of calculations that you have to do. And I just like having to deal with one heading, direct. That's one wind calculation, maybe two, maybe three. That's it. But depending on how, what kind of instructor you have or how he wants you to do it, that's not usually the way I do it. I usually will do a straight line and just look out the window to my different waypoints. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's why don't we go through the activity here, just get a complete VFR flight log going on. So I've got true course 338 is going to be straight line the whole way. And then we're going to apply the wind correction angle. Actually, this spreadsheet, which I put on the shared drive, does all the calculations for you. It's pretty nifty. But what did we say? our wind was going to be 175 at 8. Okay. And then we're gonna do that all the way down until, say, the halfway point. And then we're gonna transition over to our other one, 27 at 2, 270 at 2. Okay. And then we've got our magnetic variation, 3 degrees east. I'm just gonna use that. Let's check that real quick. See if our variation changes closer to our destination.
I expect it to go to 4.
Does it go to 4? Yes, it does.
Because of how close you talk to close.
Yes, you would be correct. So we're going to do 4 then. All right, and then our deviation, if you remember on our compass card for these directions, is going to be 1 degree. So we're going to pop that in there. And there you have it. We've got our compass heading. So this spreadsheet actually does all the trig for you. It's excellent. Shouldn't keep you from learning how to use the whiz wheel, but start with our true course, wind, variance, deviation, get a compass heading. Okay. All right. It even gives us ground speed. This thing's pretty cool. So I've got my true airspeed here, 135, and it's giving us a ground speed down here. All right, we're going to talk fuel planning, see the fuel in a little bit here, but let's get to it real quick. Okay, so you guys remember we didn't have any prohibited, restricted military operation airspaces to deal with. This is a relatively benign flight from an airspace perspective. It's class Echo for most of it. Okay, so we don't really need to, if we don't want to, we don't have to talk to air traffic control, although it's highly advised, especially coming into out of Houston and into DFW terminal area. So you might contact Houston Approach on that frequency that we found in the chart supplement to get your VFR flight following. And what they're going to do is they're going to hand you off to each sector along the way. As soon as you get up to College Station, they'll hand you off to College Station Approach. As soon as you get out of that area, they're going to hand you off to Fort Worth Center. As soon as you fly further north, they'll hand you off to Regional Approach, DFW Regional Approach. So you call them once and you get the radar services the entire time. So that's what I always think is a good idea when you're taking 200 nautical mile trips. All right, so we've got, if I go back to our VFR flight plan here, we have got our compass heading, so we're good to go there. Of course, we've done our wind calculations, so we know what our ground speed's going to be, and I know what the distances are between each of our pre-selected waypoints. So with that information, we know exactly when we are going to arrive at each waypoint and the time in between each waypoint, which is crucial information. Does anybody know why?
Why knowing the time in between is so important?
Mm-hmm.
2 things come to mind. 1, are you on course? 2, fuel burn.
That's right. Yep. Are you flying the course that you planned? So, you know, as soon as I get to my first waypoint, or maybe even my second one, as soon as I get to my second waypoint, how do I get rid of that? So as I'm flying north here and I'm passing Waller off to my left, you know, first of all, am I on the right course, right? Second of all, did I get there in the right amount of time? If you look at our flight plan here, I'm due to get past the Waller intersection. 8 minutes. There to there. No, I'm sorry, it's the one above it. 6 minutes, 18 seconds. So you got your stopwatch or your iPhone or whatever, and as soon as you hit the 6 minute, 18 second point, you got to find out where you are. If you're right near your Waller checkpoint, your visual checkpoint, you're doing good. Your flight planning was spot on, meaning my ground speed, my wind planning, and my course. Now, if the 6 minute, 18 second point hits and my Waller checkpoint here is still kind of in the distance, say I'm like 3 or 4 miles before passing it, well, that means it's taking me longer to get to my waypoint, which means I'm actually traveling slower than planned, which means the overall trip is going to be longer, which of course means I'm going to burn more fuel by the time I get to my destination. So you got to keep in mind those little rules of thumb so that as you get to your checkpoints, you know that, hey, my flight plan's spot on. I'm burning the right amount of fuel that I calculated. And my course, I am on my course line. My wind correction planning was spot on. And then you can make little adjustments. You're not really going to have time to pull out this spreadsheet during the flight, but you can make little adjustments here and there during the flight to account for those variations. Now, if you made a gross mistake with your fuel planning, you might have to think about an alternate spot to land and get fuel. Usually, if you've attempted a good flight plan here, though, you're not going to be grossly off. Okay, so continuing on the thread of performance planning, I'm going to go through all of the performance charts that I would go through for this particular flight. And depending on how well you know your aircraft and where you're operating in and out of, you may or may not do some of these calculations, but for the point of exercise, I think it's good to go over these and see where we're operating. All right, so first and foremost, and of course, 14 CFR 91 dot something, I think it's like 119, requires you to understand takeoff and landing distances. So we're going to calculate that right now. But right away, you notice that the chart that we're given in the pilot's operating handbook is in terms of density altitude. Do you guys remember what density altitude is?
Yep.
Give it to me.
It's the actual altitude adjusted for non-standard temperatures.
That's right. Yep. It's your pressure altitude adjusted for non-standard temperature. Temperature, if you remember that chemistry equation, PV equals rho RT, as temperature changes, it has a profound effect on the atmosphere. So hence why performance charts, especially takeoff, landing, climb, cruise performance charts are typically in density altitude reference. Now, the pilot's operating handbook that I have for this aircraft does not have a conversion chart for density altitude. They make you actually calculate it on your own. So there are a million ways to do this, but one of my favorite ways, one of the ways that I like to do it is to just have somebody tell me what it is real time. So let's go over to that. And there's like 1.5 million ways you can get this information, but I'm just going to use this method, airnav.com. I'm going to go to Sugarland. And we're just, if we are able to, we are just going to call up the AWAS station at Sugarland. Well, it doesn't look, yep, here we go. Hey, Alan, do you know if Sugarland has a density altitude readout on their ASOs?
I have not heard density altitude. I've only ever heard the altimeter setting.
Okay, let's go to an AWAS station then. We'll go to Executive, Houston Executive, because we know that one's close by. Like I said, you can calculate this, and maybe that's more enjoyable for you, but I just like to have someone tell me what it is.
Temperature 33 Celsius, 2.19 Celsius. Altimeter 3001. Remarks, density altitude 2,200.
All right. 2,200. Was that clear enough for you guys? Could you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the method of someone just telling you what it is. So 2,200. So there's our 2,000 line. Oh, sorry. 2,000 line, 2,200, maybe somewhere right there. And so what I'm interested in is my ground run and my takeoff distance over 50-foot obstacle. So how long is it going to take me to take off over a 50-foot obstacle? So I'm going to come over here and find out that my ground run for we're going to do no flaps. So 0 degrees of flaps is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,400 feet. And then my takeoff distance over a 50-foot obstacle, meaning, you know, what is the horizontal distance for my aircraft to actually climb up over a 50-foot obstacle, is going to be somewhere around 2,800. Nope, that's 2,300 feet. And just for point of exercise, I'm just going to record these values in case we want to come back and talk about them. So I'm looking at like a 1,400-foot ground run and about a 2,300-foot 50-foot obstacle. Okay, so if I look at you know, Sugarland's runway, I'm almost positive that we're going to be able to operate at Sugarland. I think they've got like an 8,000-foot runway, right?
They do. Yeah, you'd have no problem.
Yeah. So if I look at the sectional and I read the legend for Sugarland, you can see the 80 down here where my mouse hand is the length of the longest runway. So we will have no problems with our Piper Arrow taking off with a ground run of 1,400 feet. And then if I want to know what my climb performance is going to be, then I'm going to go back to my performance planning charts, my density altitude of 2,200 feet, and then making a bunch of assumptions up here, which probably won't be the case. Probably won't have a full aircraft. I'll have to see what I'm assuming in my weight and balance. But assuming worst case, full aircraft, then I'm looking at a climb rate of somewhere in the neighborhood of you know, 760, 770 feet per minute. You know, and this is probably one that I would leave out if I'm flying in Texas. But if I'm flying in Colorado or I'm flying in Arizona, you know, and I'm having to like avoid a mesa off the end of the runway, then I'm going to want to know what climb performance I can expect out of my aircraft. Here in Texas, once you're off the ground, you typically don't really need to worry about it, but it's good to know. All right. I told you guys already to assume that we had 135 knot true airspeed, but there is a chart to calculate it. So given density altitude, you can find out, well, given density altitude and power setting, I can get my true airspeed. This gives it in miles per hour, but you can get it in knots. And probably most importantly, I'm going to want to just verify, even though I know this airplane, I've flown it a bunch of times, I just want to make sure that my fuel planning is in line and I've got a positive range and I can get to my destination with a reserve. So I'm going to be using 75% power. In fact, before we do that, why don't we just look at that real quick? Let's get the power setting. We know what we're gonna use, so we can do those two charts. So I'm gonna, and this is the power setting table for the Piper Arrow. As you guys might remember from the performance charts session, the cruise power setting is usually in tabular format, and it's going to give you RPM settings for the engine based on pressure, altitude, and temperature. And this particular chart for the Piper Arrow is all standard. So you'll notice very slight variations if you're operating in non-standard conditions. If you guys remember, standard conditions is a 59 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. So we said we're going to be cruising around 6,500 feet, right? So here's my 6,000 number. We can interpolate if we would like in between 6,000 and 7,000. But there's really no need to because what the chart's telling me is that at the 6,500 foot mark, I'm going to be full throttle for 75% rated horsepower. So essentially, high level, what this is telling me is that at this altitude, at 6,500 feet, pressure altitude under standard conditions, I can expect no better than 75% of my engine's rated horsepower because I've already got the thing jammed into the firewall. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. So already the effects of density, altitude, and thinner air are having an effect on the ability for the aircraft engine to produce its rated horsepower. So let's go back up to our charts here and let's calculate range. So I'm going to be using a 75% number. And I'm not going to worry about reserve for now. Let's calculate our own reserve, okay? So on no reserve, meaning, you know, run out of fuel scenario, at 75%. And so we've got to use a density altitude at our cruising height, at our cruising altitude. There is no tool that's going to give this to you like we just had. There's no AWOS or ASOS or weather report that's going to give this to you. You've got to calculate it. And you can do that on your whiz wheel. If you guys want to get it out, we can go to a quick example.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back over. And for the purposes of this, it's an en route calculation. So I'm going to pick a reporting station. I'm going to use the College Station reporting, wind and temperature report. If you guys remember, the winds aloft weather forecast also gives you temperature. You know what? We've been using ForeFlight the whole time. Let's use a different tool. Let's use Aviation Weather Center, winds and temperatures. And we're going to do it old school way. We're going to use this old school method. All right. So CLL. Okay. Well, this is real helpful. The winds are light and variable at 6,000 feet. Is that 6,000 feet? No, that's 9,000. Okay. And then our temperature is a positive 16 degrees centigrade. All right. So on the front of our whiz wheel, the calculator side, opposite the wind side. So we're on the calculator side now. You see there's a little window you see where it says pressure, altitude, thousands of feet?
Yeah.
There's a window to the right, and it's got a 0, 5, 10, 15 in it.
Yes.
And then above that window, there's a miniature Celsius scale, positive 50, 0, negative 50.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to line up the plus 16 degrees centigrade line. Good luck finding that. With the 6,500 foot pressure altitude line. And when you've got that all lined up, tell me what your readout says on the window above that one where it says density altitude.
So we're looking, so take 16 degrees and put it over 6,500, right?
Yes, the 16-degree tick mark over the 6,500 tick mark inside the window.
Okay.
And then above that window is another window. It says density altitude with a little pointer.
I'm getting roughly 8,000.
That's right. That's what I got. So if we're cruising at 6,500, okay, pressure altitude, and we need to correct for a non-standard temperature because I can tell you right now, 16 degrees Celsius is not standard for 6,500 feet.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, 15 degrees is standard for sea level. So what does that tell you? It's definitely a lot colder at 6,000, and 16 is very hot for that level.
Yep.
So 16 degrees, correcting our pressure altitude will give you a density altitude of 8,000 feet. So your aircraft is going to perform as if it's at 8,000 feet. All right, back to our calculator, back to our chart. So we're at a density altitude of 8,000 feet, even though our aircraft's really flying at 6,500. So we come over here, following the 8,000 line, and we've got to extrapolate our 75. So we've got to mentally extrapolate this line up. And it looks like it crosses somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 750 miles. And that's without any reserve. So essentially, with an 8,000 foot density altitude at 75% power, our aircraft will fly 750 statute miles and then fall out of the sky because it runs out of gas. So if we put a 45-minute reserve on, like this chart would indicate, we could stop at our dotted line. But what I like to do, to be completely honest with you guys, is utilize a gallons per hour figure and relate it back to our flight time, okay, and determine how many gallons we're going to need for the flight. So from a fuel planning perspective, I've got 1 hour, 35 minutes. So let's just call it with taxi and all that. Let's call it an even 2 hours. That right there is conservative flight planning. So 2 hours. All right, and 75% rated power says we're going to burn 10.15 gallons per hour. So multiply the two together to get the number of gallons we're gonna burn during the flight. 20 gallons. And so my aircraft holds 48 usable gallons of fuel. So I take my usable and I subtract my used, I'm going to land with somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 gallons. So it's always good to know how much longer you can fly with that fuel in case you get into an emergency or an issue. So I always take that fuel remaining number, and I always divide it out by the gallons per hour to determine just how long I could continue flying the airplane. Very healthy amount. VFR, according to the regulations, under day VFR, we have to have 30 minutes of fuel remaining in the tanks. And we're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours and 45 minutes. So taking off with 48 gallons is very conservative flight planning. So we're not going to have any fuel issues here. All right, so we've done cruise performance planning. We've got our power performance planning going on. Now we want to calculate our landing performance, because the FAA regs state that we've got to know takeoff and landing distances for the airports that we're flying into. And then we'll go conservative here, and we'll do a 50-foot obstacle. So here's that density altitude again, and I'm not gonna, again, let's go to a source of information that'll just tell it to us. Here's the Alliance Airport. Let's see if they give us a phone number that we can call. Yeah, here we go. 817-91.
Celsius, 2.18 Celsius. Altimeter 2,908. Remarks: density altitude 3,000.
Okay. So Alliance Airport's actually calling for 3,000-foot density altitude. So we're going to be operating up here. And so if I'm going to have to deal with an obstacle at the Alliance Airport, then I'm going to be requiring somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1,400, maybe a 1,450 foot landing distance. Again, using these assumptions up here, which we know is not necessarily going to be true, right? We know our aircraft is not going to be at maximum gross weight because we're going to burn off a bunch of fuel. But worst case scenario flight planning, we're going to need about call it a 1,500, 14 to 1,500 foot runway to accomplish our landing distance at least. So we'll come back here to the charts and see what we're dealing with at Alliance. So back to my sectional. And you're going to see that Alliance actually is in pretty good shape. Its longest runway is 11,000 feet. So we're going to have, 9 times the landing distance that, we're not going to have any issues at Alliance. They fly 747s in and out of this airport.
Now typically you wouldn't want to just check the distance of the longest runway, but the runway that's currently in use, right?
Yeah, I think from a flight planning perspective, though, if you check the distance of the longest runway, you at least know that if you were to get into a situation where you needed 11,000 feet, it would be there for you in an emergency situation.
Got it.
And there's no real way for you sitting in your chair in Houston to know which runway they're using in Alliance.
You can't call up ATIS?
I guess you could. Yeah, I guess you could. I was about to say you could listen to live ATC.
Yeah.
But you know what? Even if you check the ATIS now, it could change in 2 hours.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. This ATIS doesn't have a phone number, but some of them do. Some of the ATIS do have phone numbers. So, okay. So that's our landing distance. We are good to go there. And with that, we've covered all of our performance planning, and we're on to weight and balance. So this is our weight and balance, and I've assumed that it's just me flying, or just one passenger, one pilot. So let's do a quick weight and balance here, somewhat of a little review of our weight and balance session. If you guys remember, to get your final weight and balance figures, you're gonna need a total moment. That's the first thing you're gonna need, and you're gonna need a total weight. Okay, and if you remember back to the fundamentals of weight and balance, that's a really good straight line. If you've got a pivot point and you put a force, say like on a seesaw, then the moment acting on that seesaw is always going to be the weight of the force times the distance to the fulcrum. So for the Piper Arrow, as is the case with most airplanes, here's the airplane. The reference point's out here at the nose. So so that's essentially where the fulcrum is in the fulcrum example. So all the arms are based off of that reference point. So we need a moment for each particular weight that we're going to consider. So here's our aircraft's weight and its arm. And if we multiply the two, we've got the moment arm. Same thing for each weight category here. So there's the pilot plus the arm and the moment. Not considering any passengers. And then our fuel multiplied by the arm and the moment. And so what we do here, if you guys remember, oh, and we got bags too, is we add up all of our moments, so we get the sum of our moments. And we get the sum of our weights. And then we simply are looking for our center of gravity and our total weight. Remember, you need center of gravity and total weight in order to calculate a full weight and balance calculation. You need to know if your aircraft is within the center of gravity limitations and if you're at or under your maximum gross weight, operating weight. And so what do you do there? You take the sum of your, you essentially find the arm for the total weight equation. So you're going to take your sum of your moments and you're going to divide by the sum of your weights to get your CG. And in this particular example, we've got an 86.97 inches aft of the fulcrum center of gravity. So somewhere here, somewhere from this fulcrum point backwards, 86.97 inches is where our center of gravity is going to be. Oh, and by the way, we've got a 2247 pound total weight package. Does the calculation make sense to you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So then we come over here with our information and we plot it. You can see somebody's taken the liberty of doing that and not erasing it in my POH. So 86.97 and 2247, let's find where that is. 86, 87, so 86.97 is up here, and 2247 somewhere here.
So the limits.
So we are well within the, you can't really see it, but here's the forward limit, and here's the aft limit of the chart. So we are well within the weight limitations of the aircraft for this particular flight. Now, you can also go ahead and calculate the reduced fuel weight of your aircraft by taking the, what was it, about 29 gallons left over when you land, and get a total weight for the arrival calculation, and then you can draw, you know, your second point and find out where you're going to be when you land, to make sure that throughout the entire flight envelope, you're operating within the weight and balance limits of the aircraft. All right. Any questions on weight and balance?
Negative.
Okay. All right. So next, so we've got our course. So we plotted our course. We've got our waypoints. We have filled out our VFR flight plan. We've done performance planning. We did a weight and balance. Finally, one of the last steps here is weather. And as you guys know from watching the videos, weather can obviously make or break. So let's do, I'm going to get rid of some tabs here. I'm going to go into a tool that I just recently started using maybe a year ago. And this is one of the fully legal methods of getting a weather briefing. It's the same information that you can get at other sources like ForeFlight, but this happens to be a legal method. It's Flight Service Station, FSS. It's their website, 1-800-WXBrief.com. You know, you can also call them. You can call the 1-800 number, or you can go to the website. I like the website because I can digest the information at a speed that is good for me. Now, you do have to put in some minimal information here on the flight plan page to get your briefing. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to be VFR. There's my aircraft ident. I'm a P-28 Romeo. It's aircraft type. GPS is the type of equipment I have. Actually, I don't think I need to even put that in for this, but it's pre-populated because I've got my aircraft profile in here. And we're going to be cruising at 6,500 feet. Sugarland Alliance, and I'm going to be 1 hour and 35 minutes en route, and I've got 4 hours of fuel, and we're going to depart today, and we're going to depart at 6 p.m. local time. I'm going to leave the route of flight blank because I've mapped out a direct course straight to. And I think that's all I need to enter. So I've got all my information in here. I'm going to hit.
So fuel on board is 4,000?
So the format is hours, minutes.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay. So 4 hours, minutes. So 40 hours?
Oh, shoot. You're right. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Now I feel better.
Good catch, man. Shit, that'd be a heavy airplane.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I got that format right here. Yeah. 01 to 35. Yeah. Good catch. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get a weather briefing. And as you guys remember from the last session on weather, I can get a standard briefing, an Outlook briefing, or an updated or abbreviated briefing. Well, it's the day of the flight because we're going on the flight today, so I'm going to get a standard briefing. All right, here's what it pulls up. It's the same information that the person on the phone is going to see, by the way, if he or she gives you a briefing in person. So there's a whole bunch of information here. We're going to go through it one by one. So TFRs, you always go through adverse conditions first. So things like TFRs, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, SIGMETs, airmets, stuff like that. So there's only one active TFR during my flight time. By the way, this briefing tool is smart enough to use your true airspeed, your departure time, and your time en route to know when you're going to be at different areas of the flight. So it knows that when I'm transitioning up here near Dallas-Fort Worth area, it knows that there's a TFR that's active during my route of flight, okay?
That's pretty cool.
Yep. and it's over here in Dallas. If you look at the ForeFlight, it's right there. So no other TFRs though, so we're good there. And then high priority NOTAMs. NOTAM stands for Notice to Airmen. And they want, you know, during the adverse conditions portion, they want to tell you about any airport closures or unsafe activity at an airport. And there is, in fact, a NOTAM for Alliance. Is that big enough for you guys to read?
Yes.
Okay. So essentially what this is saying is that Alliance Airport runway, 16 left, 34 right, the northern 391 feet is closed starting during 2017, September 13th, at this time, 1305, to 2018, January 2nd at 2300 Zulu. So what do I have to know for my flight? Well, if I'm going to land on runway 16 left, 34 right, well, the most northern 400 feet is going to be closed. Other than that, there's no other NOTAMs for closures or unsafe. No convective signets, no signets. There is, however, AirMet Tango. Oh no, AirMet Sierra. Okay. So if you remember, AirMet Sierra was the IFR AirMet to tell pilots of conditions where you might have ceilings below 1,000 feet or visibility less than 3 miles. And here's my AirMet. So this entire shaded region, there is a chance that I could run into IFR conditions. And here's the actual forecast AirMet readout here. So what does this tell me? This essentially is a good heads-up indicator for a VFR pilot to pay special attention to the METARs and the TAFs when we go through them here in a second. This report is simply an AirMet. It's going to tell you about conditions that are forecast, but it's not going to give you specific airports. It's not going to give you even specific values. It says 3 miles mist and fog, but it's not assigning that to a terminal area. So we're going to look for this in the TAFs and the METARs when we get to that in a minute. But it's a good heads up that I may not be able to make my flight. So. And freezing level is always a standard report, but it's the middle of summer. It's almost 100 degrees in September, so I'm pretty sure we don't have to worry about freezing levels. But if you wanted to, freezing level appears to be about 16,000 feet around Texas. Okay, and if you look up here to the top left where the tabs are, I really only have to click on the ones that have a yellow circle because that's where there's actual information for me. So, you know, there's no signets, there's no convective signets. So I'm gonna slide on over here to the synopsis, and I'm looking at my time. I've got 3 o'clock. Are you guys good to go for a few more minutes?
I could probably go for 5 minutes, but I'll have to check out. But you guys can keep going. Okay.
All right. So essentially, we've got a weather pattern here. You know, they'll give you a high-level surface analysis map, and Texas is looking pretty good. I mean, we've got a stationary front in North Texas with some weather, but nothing that would keep us from making our flight until we start getting to some of our METARs and TAFs. We can take a look at that. All right, so here's all our METARs, and I like to take a high-level look at the colors here, green being VFR. And it looks current weather-wise, it looks pretty good along the whole route of flight. If I want to, I can read some of the text. I can check out like College Station METAR. I can check out Alliance where I'm headed. But by and large, I mean, we've got a pretty good looking flight. So College Station is reporting clear skies. And then you'll cross-reference between here and your sectional to look for certain airports. I kind of know them because I've been flying around the area. But you know, Lancaster, which is in South Dallas, which is pretty close to our course, is reporting clear. So we've got some decent weather. We do have to kind of watch out though. There's a couple Houston airports like Hooks Airport, David Wayne Hooks, which is north. Oops. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. That's not it. Here we go. So that's North Houston is actually reporting some cloud cover. Scattered 4,800. So you just have to kind of watch out for clouds too, because as a VFR pilot, you can't fly in the clouds, but you can fly above them, underneath them, as long as you maintain cloud clearance requirements. And then in the current weather area, you're also going to get any PIREPs. So it looks like there is a PIREP along our route of flight. And I'm going to look at this. So over the Leona VOR LOA at 1903 Zulu, so about an hour ago. Flight level 3,000 feet, so underneath our altitude. Type unknown. So they have some clouds in this report. They're reporting cloud bases at 3,000 feet. So this is a pilot flying above the clouds and saying, hey, the base of the clouds is 3,000 feet. So that's good to know. Good to know that there's going to, you know, to at least expect some cloud cover along our route of flight. All right, and then we've got weather forecasting. And hey, Alan, if you do take off, I'll just continue this. And if Chris, if you hang around, that's cool. And then just reference the end of the video if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm just gonna silently drop off when I do.
Okay. Okay. So after we're done looking at our current weather, then our briefing is going to go through weather forecasts. And so you've got different forecasting tools here. We've already looked at some of the information, such as wind and temperature, because we had to do that for our flight planning. So we kind of know what our winds are doing, and of course we know that we've got the 16 degrees Celsius at altitude. But because we have that AirMet Sierra out for IFR conditions, I want to look at our terminal forecast, our TAF, to understand what I can expect at certain TAF reporting locations. And this tool is smart enough to know when you're going to be passing the station. And it highlights the most relevant forecasting time in green. So if you're like College Station here and you've got multiple TAF reporting times, then it's going to highlight the one that's most relevant to your flight time. So similar to what we're seeing in the pilot reports and the METARs, there's scattered clouds in some of these reporting stations for a forecast. And I'm looking out the window right now and I see scattered clouds. So it looks like the scattered clouds are going to continue to persist. So, you know, from a clouds perspective, what is, you know, this right here is a pretty important part of our briefing, because as a VFR pilot, you have to maintain your VFR minimum cloud clearance requirements that we went over, depending on which airspace you're in. You also cannot fly in the clouds, so you have to understand what altitude the clouds are at. We're flying at 6,500 feet, and I'm seeing cloud bases at 4,000 feet. So there's a pretty good chance that 6,500 feet may be, maybe too low of an altitude. I may, if I am going to embark on this trip, I actually might mentally prepare to fly at a higher altitude. And Chris, to your point earlier, I might actually take some wind planning with me. If I'm going to fly at 9,000 feet, then I might do a separate flight plan for 9,000 feet, just so I know what my wind correction angles are going to be. So this is actually pretty, I'll say, may not be a decision point for me, but I do have to be concerned about these scattered clouds, because I'm not going to be flying through them. I've got to avoid them. Now, when I get up to Alliance in the Fort Worth area, it looks like the forecast is actually more favorable from a cloud coverage perspective. It goes down to few clouds, which is less coverage than scattered. Remember, from a coverage standpoint, we've got overcast, which is completely blocked, broken, which is blocked, and you've got some breaks in the clouds, scattered, which is, more scattered than broken. It's less coverage than broken. And then you've got few, which is extremely little coverage. So I would probably still embark on this flight, given that it's scattered and not broken, as a VFR flight. And then of course few is even better for me. It's even more favorable as I get to my destination. Any questions on the cloud coverage discussion? Because that's a pretty important aspect of this particular real-time flight.
Would you prefer to change the altitude versus changing the route to go around them?
Absolutely, yeah. Because a direct route that we have right now is the absolute shortest distance between A and B.
Okay.
Yep, you bet. Now, if there was a thunderstorm over here, if there was a hypothetical piece of weather that I needed to avoid, there's certain things like thunderstorms and low pressure cold front systems that you just can't avoid with altitude. So you would have to adjust your route. But clouds, you can typically adjust your altitude and get above them. Here's our winds aloft forecast. We've already done this, so I'm going to skip it. We've already done our winds aloft calculations, but in case we want to review them again, or try to pick a different altitude, we can. Knowing that we've got clouds to deal with, I might study the 9,000 foot forecast just to see if there's any unfavorable or favorable wind conditions, but 6,500 we'll stick with for now. And then finally, from a forecasting perspective, we've got our area forecast. And if you remember, this is that longer report that has the different regions in them. And of course, what I'm going to care about is going to be Houston. And then it even breaks Houston down into different areas. So west of 90, east of 90, north of 26. So looks like during the forecasting period, they are calling for VFR, but they're also calling, depending on where you're at, they are calling for isolated rain showers. So it looks like over the next 24 hours, you guys are going to get some weather. But we're not hanging around Houston too long. We're departing, I said 1800 local time. So the area forecast doesn't do much for us. The TAF, the terminal area forecast, is much more useful for our purposes. All right, and then after weather forecast, then we're going to go into a deep dive on NOTAMs. Now, the flight service station is going to consolidate and present to you every single notice to airmen, NOTAM, that exists for your route of flight. It's extremely annoying because there are hundreds of NOTAMs presented to you, depending on how long your flight is. And the unfortunate reality is you just do not have time to review all of them. And I'll show you why here as we go through it. The way that flight service organizes NOTAMs is by departure, destination, en route, general NOTAMs, international NOTAMs, meaning if you're transitioning Texas on an international flight plan, and then NOTAMs that are not categorized in any of those prior categories. And you're going to see a ton of NOTAMs presented. And it's unfortunately just not possible to review all of them. And this is one of today's major focuses for the FAA, is because they know that that this is not a very efficient method of communicating flight service and pilots. But to get a flavor for what's included in NOTAMs, they include things such as obstructions, runway NOTAMs, like for instance at Sugar Land, the runway 35 7,000 foot distance remaining sign light is out of service during these times. So it down to the nitty gritty regarding different airport and airspace notices. What I usually like to focus on is the closed and special NOTAMs that are issued as part of the adverse conditions. I also like to focus on any NOTAMs that are issued under the aerodrome, which is right down here. If an airport is closed, it's going to be under this particular header. And I will pay more attention to departure and destination NOTAMs. So I will typically always read all these NOTAMs here just to ensure that it doesn't apply to my flight. And then I'm going to also read these NOTAMs down here. These are general NOTAMs for instrument procedures. So if I'm on an instrument flight plan, I'm going to want to understand if these affect my flight or not. But you can see really quickly that these are numerous. There's tons of NOTAMs. So I always make a point to read my destination NOTAMs as well. So here's any notices for navigation equipment. This would be more pertinent to the instrument pilot. Notices for obstructions. So for instance, there is a rig there. So at Alliance, here's an obstruction tower, 4.1 nautical miles east-southeast of Alliance Airport at 1,039 feet. And it is not lit. So there's no lights. And here's the time period. So this could be of interest to us if we are going to drop down and fly at a lower altitude. And then there's runway NOTAMs. So you know, we won't go through all these, but you can see there's just a ton of stuff to review. And the reality is you just don't have time to review it all. So I review departure, destination. I typically don't review all the en route ones. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to apply to you. I mean, look how many there are.
Yeah. Are the en route ones showing you all of the different terminals?
Yes, all the different airports. Mm-hmm. Because the thought process is, well, if you have to make a emergency landing in College Station, or say your plans change and you need to land at Waco, Well, then they want to make sure that they presented all of Waco Airport's NOTAMs to you.
Got it.
Yeah. Look how many obstruction NOTAMs there are for the route of flight.
Goodness.
Yeah, just don't have time to review them all. But what does make it easy is this graphic here. The graphic on the right, they try to make it easy and identify graphically anything that's in text. So like, for instance, if my route of flight took me through this P49, which is George Bush's ranch, then I would be able to look over here and find the text for that and potentially read it. Yeah, somewhere. And so there's just more NOTAMs. Your flight instructor will probably have a very good method of what to look at, but I'm hopeful that they definitely at least want you to look at departure and destination NOTAMs. The en route is just almost too much to read. So more general NOTAMs. There's a general NOTAM for State Department security since we're next to Mexico. It's probably 300 pages long. And then the international NOTAMs, like I mentioned, these will be for notices that affect international terminal areas, like IAH is an international airport, DFW. So likely it's not going to pertain to our flight. And then here's the proverbial dumping ground for anything that they don't put in the other categories. So, and then just a couple more tabs here. They have air traffic control. If you're flying in or out of a major terminal area like Houston Hobby or DFW, then you would want to review this flow control tab because they've got airport delays, air traffic control delays. And so if you were departing like Houston Hobby, you would want to know what your takeoff departure delay might be. If it's several hours, you might not, you might delay your flight completely or whatever. But again, it's one of those things where you have to really, maybe even copy this into a Word document and try to find it because it's just a ton of stuff. So, and then there is a new tab that they just incorporated this year for unidentified flying objects, drones, since drones are becoming so popular. They've got this special tab to talk about drone operation or unmanned aircraft operation. And it's typically military, but like, let's see, we've got one for our route of flight. There's one that they're calling out close to DFW, and it's pretty high. It's surface to 1,200 feet, which is 380 feet off the ground, and they give it a radius. So they kind of draw boundaries around it. But if we stay on our course, we're not going to hit it, but it's going to be to our right. So that might be a mental note or something we write down. Just say, look out for drones. They're going to be close to the ground, 380 feet. And then anytime you see green on the chart, it means that the condition exists, but not during your planned transition. So you can see the note over here. It starts 60+ minutes after the flight estimated to leave the area. And then during hurricane season, they always have some miscellaneous hurricane, tropical cyclone forecasts, and a couple other convective, just some general weather stuff. But doesn't look like convective weather issues are gonna keep us from flying this flight plan today anyway. Volcanic ash. There's no volcanoes in Texas, right?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. So that right there is a full flight briefing from flight service.
Awesome.
Takeaways for me for a VFR flight is going to be the clouds. So really, the big takeaway from this particular weather briefing is going to be the scattered clouds. I'm just going to have to kind of be mindful. May have to adjust my cruise altitude depending on when we get out there, and see what we see. Yeah, that's really the only big takeaway I have from this particular briefing. All right, so that's the weather. That's the weather briefing, weather planning. And then there's really one final step, and this is even, you can even do this once you get in the airplane. But like we talked about before, kind of rehash through it. For the flight, are we going to do a VFR flight plan and actually file it with flight service? And you can actually do that. If I back up here and go to our flight service page, you can actually take this flight plan that we filled out with all of the flight information, and then we can actually file it. We can hit the file button, and it'll file it with the FAA. And then you can activate that flight plan when you get in the airplane. The other option that you have from a flight tracking perspective is VFR flight following. We've talked about this before. This is an air traffic control service. So you get in the airplane, you depart, you contact Houston approach, and you request VFR flight following. You get VFR radar services, so traffic. They give you traffic services. You can get clearances into airspaces like we talked about. And it's a great way, in case you have an emergency, you're already in touch with somebody. Now, flight following differs from a VFR flight plan in that VFR flight plan is with flight service. If you remember, we're on flight services website here to file our VFR flight plan. We also have to open up that flight plan, activate it with flight service. You can't do it with air traffic control. This is not an air traffic control service. So they really differ. These two really differ in the amount of traffic and radar services you get. With VFR flight following, you get radar services. You're going to get cleared into airspaces. Air traffic control can navigate you around the sky and get you, through airspaces and stuff like that. Flight service has nothing to do with that. This is simply a search and rescue tool. So if you file a VFR flight plan and activate it with flight service, if you do not call flight service to terminate that flight plan upon your arrival, they actually get search and rescue going after 30 minutes.
So it's best just to do the VFR flight following with.
I think that's my vote, because you can have the best of both worlds. You're going to be in touch with a human in case you have an emergency.
Yeah.
Right. If you have an engine issue or something, you're gonna be in touch with air traffic control. Plus, you get radar services, especially around busy terminal areas like Houston. It's great because they'll clear you through airspace. They'll give you traffic avoidance. They'll tell you where traffic is that you have to look out for. Highly recommend this over the flight plan.
Okay. But
during your training, you're gonna have to do both. So they're gonna teach you how to do both during your training. There's also the option to just make the trip without having any help or talking to anybody. But this is just not smart at all. You wanna have a backup plan. I mean, at the very least, file a VFR flight plan. with an ETA, you know, and just if you have an emergency, crash your airplane and can't reach anybody, then someone will at least come try and find you. But I don't think it's very smart to not do either of these options. And then you go flying, and then you make the trip. So yeah, so in a nutshell, you plot your course. So you've got your course line, which helps you identify your waypoints. And once you have your waypoints identified and your wind forecast, you can come up with your entire VFR flight plan on this chart. And there's tons of tools like this. You can download all sorts of templates. This one's great because it does math for you, and it autofills stuff. And then secondly, you check out your course line for airspace and obstructions and waypoints here. Third, performance planning to make sure that you can adequately take off, land, and cruise and get to your destination with the fuel that you have on board. Weight and balance calculation, and then finally, weather planning, which is actually a big part of it. And that's in a nutshell what your real flight planning looks like. So, any questions?
It's a lot of details, but it's helpful to like go through the different steps.
Oh yeah, yeah. And what helps, like when you do your first cross country, you're gonna do like a 30-mile or a 50-mile cross country. Mm-hmm. You're gonna fly from Sugarland to this airport up here, whatever this is, Conroe North. It's gonna be like a really short, easy flight with 3 waypoints, so that you don't, and not a lot of different weather patterns to look at, a couple weather forecasts. So your first couple are going to be nice and short. You can practice all the steps. And then that'll help you when you plan longer trips.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So unless there's anything else, any other questions?
Yeah, one more question. I don't want to hold on that because I'm sure he knows this, but just on the wind when you're doing that, could you explain to me how you were getting the fact that there's a tailwind?
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, let's see if I can open up. Let's look at Houston here. So if I go to Sugarland, and again, there's a million ways you can do this, but if I go to Sugarland Airport and pull up their the winds. So it's shifted around a bit, but right now let's use, we'll use the 6,000 foot entry. So 205 at 9. Let me open up a new screen here. So I've got a wind forecast of 205 degrees at 9 knots. So if I've got I'm just going to draw a couple things here. If I've got my compass rose here and I've got north up here, and then south right down here, my wind, if you remember, the wind forecast or the wind reports are always oriented where the wind's coming from. So, around the compass rose, south is 180. So this particular wind at 6,000 feet is out of 205. So I don't know, somewhere like in this direction here.
Okay. Because
that would be direction 205 around the compass rose. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And so our particular flight had a true course. If you remember, all these wind forecasts are in reference to true north. So our flight, and I'm forgetting the number, 338 true. So in reference to 360 north, that's like probably that direction. So when I said tailwind, predominantly speaking, the wind is acting on our tail.
Okay.
As opposed to if we go up to Fort Worth, we saw the wind forecast change up there. I believe it was more of a headwind. So let's go to Fort Worth and pick. Maybe not. I thought I saw more of a headwind forecast. I might be wrong. But if you saw it in your wind forecast, if you saw something to the effect of, let's say 300 degrees at 20 knots, then knowing that the wind forecast is the direction the wind's always coming from, then that wind is going to be coming from 300 degrees, which is somewhere up here on the compass rose. And it's acting more of a headwind to our direction of flight, if our direction of flight is still 338.
Okay. And does your wind correction, does your heading change depending on whether it's a tailwind or a headwind?
So the wind correction angle is a function of two items. One, it's a function of the direction, and two, it's a function of the velocity. So if, just for simplicity, if I'm traveling straight north, if my desired course is straight north, and I've got a wind that is, say, quartering, so it's coming from like a 45-degree angle, okay? Mm-hmm. The wind correction angle for that scenario is going to be less than if I've got a wind coming directly cross, so like perpendicular. And that doesn't make sense just intuitively. Then you have to think about it in terms of like crosswind components. So if this is my wind, then this is my crosswind component of that wind, and this is my headwind component of that wind down here. So a direct crosswind, like a 90-degree direct crosswind like we have over here, is always going to be more substantial of a wind for you to deal with than if it's like, you know, a quartering wind, like a 30-degree, you know. You're gonna have to correct more for the direct crosswind than you are for the quartering.
Because it's going to be pushing you more over to the right.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yep.
Because it's coming straight at you.
Yes, exactly. Because the wind that's coming directly from your cross, directly from your left, is going to have more of an impact than if it's at an angle. And as you slowly get to a total headwind, so if we go from cross to 45-degree quartering wind to a total headwind, like let's say the wind's like directly at our head, right? Mm-hmm. Then you're not going to need any wind correction angle at all because the wind's not pushing you to either direction.
But you're not going to go as fast, right?
That's right. Yeah, your ground speed's going to suffer because the wind's pushing against you.
And so you don't have to worry about that when you're just at cruising altitude. You're always taking off and landing into the wind, but you're going to correct to get to your course when you're cruising, correct?
Yes, that's right. When you're cruising is when you really care about your wind correction angle. Yep. Thank
you. That's helpful.
Oh yeah, yeah. Now you'll also notice when you go flying, because the wind's not always going to be straight up and down the runway, right? If the wind's like let's say, let me go back to if this is your airplane here, and let's say this line right here is your runway. the wind, like you said, you're always supposed to take off and land into the wind. But let's say you're landing and the wind is kind of down the runway. Let's say, you know, it's kind of a quartering wind. Well, if your airport only has one runway, like Sugar Land does, then even though your wind is quartering, your only option is to land on the runway that gives you the best headwind, right?
Yeah.
So what you'll notice is if you don't correct for that quartering wind relative to the runway, your airplane's going to continue to like push to the left.
Oh God.
So you'll have to actually point your nose to the right of the runway and fly like that. And we call that crabbing. It's called a crab angle.
Okay.
Yeah. So you'll notice the effects of wind correction even before you go and do cross-country flight planning. You'll notice it on your first lesson.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hate to say it, but this is our last session.
Oh, no. Is there a way that we can pull up the links if we needed to revisit something? I did see, like, in the drive we've got the PowerPoint presentations and the quizzes and everything.
Yeah, I'll put a hyperlink. I'll put a link to each video. If I can, I'll do it in the folders.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'll put a link to each video in the folder so it's like a one-stop shop. You just go there. And I mean, if stuff comes up, I'm open for questions. You just have to ask anything that comes up. If you need a second opinion or your instructor's not answering something quite right or whatever, it's all good. I'm here.
No, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
I also, if you're down here in Houston, I'd love to meet you in person. So let me know.
Yeah, no, for real. So I'm trying to. Alan told me that he's busy all of October. So I'm trying to vet out maybe some November dates. I don't know. Do you spend most of your time in Houston, or are you back and forth between there and New York?
I'm back and forth, but November I'll be. November I'm just out. I'm going to Australia, and I'm going to. My sister's also having a baby, so I'll be in South Carolina. But let me know though, and I can either come back and find a time or whatever.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, we try to get down to Houston a couple times a year, so we'll be in touch about it, and we'll try to plan something out. December,
I'm here the whole month, so. Okay.
Well, that'll be good because I think both you and Alan will be in flight training. It'll be really. I'm trying to fly down there and maybe do a flight with both you guys. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I mean, as you can tell, I'm not as. I'm not on the same speed as Alan is, and I'm taking this a little bit more slowly just because I've got so much travel planned.
But, yeah. I mean, everybody's got their own, time schedule, their own pace. It's not something you don't want to start and then like take 4 months off. It's like that's not the right way to do it, right?
Yeah.
So.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, good. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure, and please let me know as you study the material. I'm literally open for questions. It's all fair game.
Thank you so much. No, I've really enjoyed the class sessions.
Yep. Sounds good. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right, you too. Bye.
See ya.